Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on regions, rules, and the uneven making of British America. The core question is this: if the colonies lived under one empire, why did they build such different answers to land, labor, authority, and belonging? The core competency is to illustrate the differences that emerge between New England, the mid-Atlantic colonies, and the southern colonies. If the colonies lived under one empire, why did they build such different answers to land, labor, authority, and belonging? If the colonies all lived under the same empire, why did they learn such different lessons about authority, labor, and freedom? That question anchors the comparison because British America did not grow as one social order moving steadily toward nationhood. It grew as several regional systems that solved different problems with different tools. A compact New England town, a Chesapeake tobacco plantation, and a Pennsylvania port city could all fly the king's flag and still teach ordinary people sharply different habits of obedience, bargaining, landholding, worship, and public life. The Mayflower Compact shows the point at the moment of creation. The passengers aboard the Mayflower reached Cape Cod outside the jurisdiction where they had expected to settle. That left them with a practical problem before they faced their first winter. If the patent did not clearly cover their landing place, who could command obedience, assign work, punish disorder, and keep the company together long enough to survive? The answer was not a speech about universal equality. The answer was a short agreement to form a civil body politic and submit to laws made for the colony's general good. Survival came first. Legitimacy had to be produced on site. That opening clarifies the settlement pattern because New England political habits grew from compact settlement, congregational religion, family farming, town governance, and the expectation that neighbors would watch one another closely. Meeting houses sat at the center of town life. Schools anchored the system because literacy served scripture, contracts, sermons, and local records. Town meetings gave many free male householders a place to vote on taxes, roads, fences, pasture use, and militia obligations. The same system also disciplined dissenters, banished religious challengers, and treated social disorder as a danger to the whole community. The colonies are often reduced to a flat chart: New England religious, Chesapeake agricultural, middle colonies diverse. That chart hides the main issue. Region was a machinery problem. Each colonial zone built a different working answer to the same questions: who controls land, who organizes labor, who pays local costs, who speaks for the community, who can be pushed outside the community when order feels threatened. Once we ask those questions, regional difference stops looking decorative. It becomes the early training ground for later arguments over taxation, representation, slavery, and political power. A settler raised in a Massachusetts town, a planter family in Tidewater, Virginia, and a merchant household in Philadelphia would all use English political language, but they would hear different things inside words such as order, liberty, property, obligation, and consent. Start with New England after Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. Puritan migration in the 1630s produced more family settlement than the early Chesapeake had seen. Colonists arrived as isolated young men seeking quick profit in some cases, and as households seeking stable communities in many others. That difference shaped institutions. When families settle in compact towns, they build meeting houses, schools, burial grounds, commons, and local roads. They record births, marriages, land transfers, and church membership. Congregational discipline gives ministers and elders moral authority, while town governments handle practical needs through meetings and elected local officers. Massachusetts Bay also reveals the limits of local participation. The colony prized covenant and public order. Church membership shaped standing. Dissenters such as Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson exposed the cost of maintaining religious uniformity in a society that believed error could damage the whole body. Town government could be participatory and restrictive at the same time. That is one of the central New England lessons. The Chesapeake developed under a different sequence of pressures. Virginia and Maryland had fertile land and a cash crop with Atlantic demand. Tobacco reorganized the region because it demanded acreage, seasonal labor, curing barns, transport to inspection points, and links to English merchants and credit networks. Tobacco also exhausted soil, which pushed planters outward in search of fresh land. The result was dispersed settlement rather than compact towns. County courts controlled daily governance more than town meetings. Riverland shaped settlement more than village greens. Warehouses, wharves, and plantation accounts shaped daily life. Disease intensified the problem. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses produced a harsher mortality pattern than New England faced. High death rates weakened family stability, encouraged short-term accumulation, and made labor supply a constant concern. Indentured servants filled much of the early labor need. Young migrants signed contracts exchanging years of labor for passage, room, board, and the promise of freedom dues at the end of service. Yet the same system also generated tension, harsh discipline, and competition for land. Once service ended, the headright system tied those pressures together. Colonial officials granted land, often 50 acres, to those who financed the transport of laborers into Virginia. Paper records in county offices thus translated migration into acreage. The rule rewarded investors in large estates and pushed settlement onto native land. It encouraged population growth and rewarded a class of people able to convert transport costs into territorial control. Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic followed still another path. William Penn imagined Pennsylvania as both a Quaker refuge and a profitable colony. Quaker theology emphasized inner light, plain dealing, and a more peaceful relation to authority than many contemporaries preferred. Penn's frame of government, the colony's promotional literature, and the regular surveying of town and rural lots all signaled an orderly settlement project. Philadelphia became a major port. Grain, livestock, flour, and Atlantic trade developed alongside small farming and artisan work. Germans, Dutch, English, Scots-Irish, Quakers, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Mennonites, Jews, and others lived closer together than they did in the more homogeneous Puritan towns. Pluralism did not remove power struggles, it did require more negotiation. A colony with many churches and ethnic groups could not rely on one congregational discipline system the way Massachusetts often tried to do. Commercial disputes, printed argument, urban governance, and assembly politics all took on greater weight. The middle colonies did not escape inequality, empire, or land conflict with native peoples. They did develop a stronger habit of bargaining across difference. The people inside these systems lived under different pressures, and those pressures trained different civic reflexes. New England ministers and magistrates worried about cohesion. A covenant community could not endure if families ignored church discipline, refused militia obligations, neglected schooling, or challenged the colony's religious purpose. Selectmen and town officers monitored fences, grazing rights, road labor, poor relief, and tax collection. Local participation therefore came with local scrutiny. A free male householder could vote in many settings and still live inside a watchful moral order. Women worked at the center of household economies but remained outside formal political power. Native neighbors encountered trade, mission pressure, land seizure, and war from communities that talked about order while expanding their own control. The Chesapeake trained power through acreage, account books, and labor command. Planters wanted servants or enslaved workers, river access, and enough political influence to protect debts and titles. County justices, sheriffs, vestries, and assemblymen held power because dispersed settlement required a local elite to handle taxes, probate, roads, militia musters, and legal disputes. Tobacco inspection laws, warehouse records, and credit relationships linked small farmers and large planters alike to Atlantic markets. When prices fell, debt pressure grew. When servants completed terms, land hunger intensified. Those conditions pushed conflict outward toward native lands and downward onto bound laborers. Between the late 17th and early 18th centuries, race hardened the system. Indentured servitude did not disappear at once. Planters increasingly turned to hereditary racial slavery because enslaved labor promised lifetime control and the transmission of status through the maternal line. Slave codes, patrols, and plantation discipline emerged as formal instruments of labor management. Region then was a legal order that answered labor scarcity with coercion. Pennsylvania's actors lived under commercial and plural pressures. Quaker leaders wanted peace and predictable settlement. Merchants wanted credit, docks, warehouse space, and reliable law. Farmers wanted access to markets. Printers wanted readers and arguments worth circulating. Assembly politics carried unusual significance because so many groups had to bargain inside the same colony. Philadelphia's port tied local life to customs, ships, insurance, and Atlantic prices. Even religious toleration had an administrative side because officials still had to record property, mediate disputes, charter institutions, and maintain order among groups that did not share one church establishment. These systems created different answers to one basic question. What kind of person gets practice in public life? New England trained many free male householders in meeting culture. The Chesapeake trained deference toward county elites and normalized deep inequality through plantation command. The Mid-Atlantic trained negotiation in assemblies, ports, and print culture. None of the regions offered broad equality, each taught a different mix of participation and exclusion. The Mayflower Compact entered Plymouth's crisis as emergency constitutional work. Its famous pledge to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic did not float above material need. Men on the ship needed a recognized authority structure before hunger, cold, and disorder tore the settlement apart. The document created legitimacy quickly enough to support labor assignments, rulemaking, and obedience. Another phrase promises just and equal laws ordered toward the colony's general good. Those words do legal work, but they require careful reading. Equal did not mean equal political standing across women, servants, native peoples, or the poor. It meant that the signers wanted law to appear legitimate among the people they counted as members of the governing body. Consent existed, but consent existed inside limits. That tension keeps the compact at the center of the problem. The compact points towards self-government, yet it also reveals how early self-government could coexist with exclusion. New England later built town meetings, school levies, militia systems, and congregational discipline from that same mixture of consent and control. The Chesapeake used English legal claims while expanding bondage. Pennsylvania promoted toleration while still grounding order in property, contracts, surveys, and colonial expansion. The compact blocks easy praise. It shows that a political community can build authority from local consent while still narrowing who counts. That pattern runs through the larger regional story. Colonial systems did not only reward virtue or industry, they distributed standing unevenly through church membership, land title, labor status, race, and sex. By the 18th century, British America contained town governments, county courts, plantation regimes, plural assemblies, seaports, small farms, slave labor systems, and expanding commercial networks. These regions would later complain about Britain together, but they would not complain from the same social ground. New England carried habits of local governance, literacy, moral surveillance, and communal obligation. The Chesapeake carried habits of elite county rule, outward land pressure, tobacco dependency, debt, and coerced labor. The Mid-Atlantic carried habits of negotiation, commerce, diversity, and printed public argument. Those habits did not disappear when imperial policy tightened. They shaped the form later resistance would take and the kind of nation that resistance could imagine. That is why the lasting consequence of regional difference is not a trivia question about climate or crops. It is a constitutional prehistory. If one region teaches that order grows from close local participation, another teaches that order grows from land command and labor discipline, and another teaches that order grows from bargaining in markets and assemblies, then later national politics begins as a struggle among institutions already trained to value different things. The unresolved judgment belongs there. Which region most strongly shaped the later United States? New England town government, Chesapeake plantation power, and Mid-Atlantic plural commerce each left durable institutional habits. The better answer may be that the country inherited all three and never fully reconciled them. America later looked united in moments of protest. But underneath that unity stood rival regional machines, each carrying its own record of who ruled, who worked, who paid, and who counted. The regional systems never reconciled their different rules for authority, labor, and belonging. The harder judgment is whether later American politics ever escaped those rival colonial machines or merely nationalized them. That problem remains open because every claim about freedom still carries a question about who was built into the community and who was pushed outside it.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.